My wife tricked me, but she regretted it the next day. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the person you trusted most has been lying to you all along. That's exactly what happened to me. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought I'd just give up. But they didn't see what was coming. Stick around to see how I turned the tables and made them pay for everything they did. I still remember the first time I met Serafina. It was one of those rare, crisp autumn days in Manhattan, the kind of day where the sun filtered through the trees in Central Park, and the air smelled faintly of fallen leaves and freshly brewed coffee. I was walking back from a meeting, the kind that left my head buzzing with numbers and projections, when I saw her. She was standing on the corner, waiting for the light to change, her scarf catching the breeze just so. I couldn't help but notice her. She had this quiet elegance, like she belonged on the cover of a glossy magazine. And when our eyes met just for a moment, it was as if the chaos of the city around us faded into the background. She smiled at me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something warm. Something real. A week later, we ran into each other again at a charity event, one of those high-profile galas filled with people in tailored suits and designer dresses, their laughter as polished as the silver trays being passed around. She recognized me right away. "Didn't the first see you on Fifth Avenue the other day?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic, yet carrying that hint of confidence that made you want to listen. We talked that night, and as the hours passed, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't in years. She laughed at my dry sense of humor, asked me about my work, and somehow made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. I told myself I had nothing to lose by asking her out for dinner. To my surprise, she said yes. Over the next few months, we grew closer. I'd pick her up after work, and we'd go to these little hole-in-the-wall Italian places in the village. She'd tell me stories about her family, the Aldens, this old, well-known name I'd heard in passing before. My father used to say, "Alden blood runs thick," she told me once, a playful smile on her lips. But what he really meant was we're all a little stubborn. I liked that about her. She had this way of making everything sound lighter, even when it wasn't. She never tried to impress me with her family's name or their supposed wealth. If anything, she seemed almost humble about it, like she didn't want it to define her. "I'd rather be known for my heart than my name," she said one night, sitting across from me at a tiny table with a checkered tablecloth. I believed her. I really did. It wasn't long before I met the rest of the Aldens. Vivienne, her mother, was this graceful, impeccably dressed woman who greeted me with a warmth that felt genuine, at least at the time. "Cassian, it's so lovely to finally meet you," she said, taking my hand with a smile that could have lit up the entire room. "Serafina's been talking about you nonstop." Her older sister Celeste, on the other hand, was sharp and quick-witted, her humor just a bit cutting. Though I figured it was her way of testing me. "So, you're the famous Cassian Mercer," she said with a sly grin. "Guess we'll see if you live up to the hype." It didn't bother me. If anything, I took it as a challenge. I wanted them to like me not because of my job or my bank account, but because I genuinely cared about Serafina. Their world was intoxicating. Lavish dinner parties at the Alden estate, with its sprawling lawn and grand marble staircase. Trips to their family's summer home on the Cape, where we'd sit by the fire as the waves crashed against the shore. It was a life I'd never known, a life I thought I could finally be a part of. I started to believe that this was what family felt like. I'd lost my parents when I was young, and while I'd always had a few close friends and colleagues, there was something about the Aldens that filled a space I hadn't realized was so empty. They welcomed me in, made me feel like I belonged. "You're one of us now," Vivienne said once, her voice warm, her hand resting on my arm. And for a while, I let myself believe that was true. But even in those early days, there were moments, small, fleeting moments where something didn't feel quite right. Like the time Vivienne asked me, almost offhandedly, if I'd mind picking up the tab for a particularly extravagant dinner. "You're so successful, Cassian," she said, her tone casual, her smile disarming. "It's nothing for someone like you." I remember hesitating for just a second before pulling out my card. I told myself it was no big deal. After all, this was family. Family helps each other, right? And Serafina, she never directly asked for anything. At least not at first. Instead, it was her touch on my shoulder, her soft words late at night. "You're amazing, Cass," she'd say, her eyes full of admiration. "You've worked so hard for everything you have. I'm so proud of you." And I wanted to believe that pride was real. I wanted to believe she loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. So I ignored the growing list of favors, the increasing frequency of "could you just help out with this one thing?" requests. I ignored the way Celeste's teasing comments started to feel less like jokes, and more like jabs. "Cassian's our golden goose," she said once, laughing as she sipped her wine. I laughed too, but the words stayed with me long after the laughter faded. I didn't realize it then, but the foundation was already shifting beneath me. The warm smiles, the gentle touches, the casual requests, they were all part of something I hadn't yet seen. I thought I was gaining a family, but what I was really gaining was a role, a function, a source. And in those early days, I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to question what felt so good, so new. I told myself I had finally found the life I'd always dreamed of. And maybe if I ignored the cracks, they'd somehow disappear. But they didn't. And as time went on, those cracks only grew wider. As time went on, I started to notice little things, subtle shifts in how Serafina's family treated me. Small favors that gradually became expectations. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Vivienne would flash her warm, practiced smile and ask if I'd mind covering the bill at a nice restaurant. Celeste, who'd always teased me like an older sister might, began casually mentioning her financial troubles over Sunday brunch. "It's just until next month," she'd say, her voice light, as if she wasn't asking me to pay her rent. I remember Serafina looking at me from across the table, her soft brown eyes silently pleading, and I'd cave. Every time. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. They were family now, right? And family helps each other out. But those small requests kept adding up. I couldn't put my finger on the moment it turned into something else. But suddenly, I felt like I was playing a role I hadn't signed up for. "Hey, Cass, I need a favor," Celeste said one afternoon, plopping down on the couch in our apartment, laptop balanced on her knees. "You know that new place on the Upper East Side? The rent is insane, but the location is perfect. I'm only short by, like, $2,000. Think you could spot me?" She smiled as if she was asking for a glass of water. I hesitated only for a second, but Serafina was right there, perched on the arm of the couch, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Cass, you know how much she needs this," she said softly. "It's just this once." I wanted to argue, to say no, but when Serafina leaned down and kissed my cheek, whispering, "You're so good to my family," I felt myself nod. And just like that, another chunk of my savings disappeared. I started noticing other patterns. Vivienne would call me dear, and tell me how proud her late husband would have been to see such a strong, generous man taking care of the family. She had this way of tilting her head just so, her pearl earrings catching the light, making it impossible to say no. Celeste was more blunt. She didn't bother with the charm. "Come on, Cass," she said once. "You're loaded. A few thousand here and there isn't gonna kill you." Serafina, though, was the master of subtle manipulation. She'd wait until we were alone, late at night, her head resting on my chest. "You know how much this means to them," she'd murmur. And to me. Her voice was so soft, so sincere. I believed she meant it, that she genuinely cared. But deep down, I started to feel the pressure. The first real crack came during a family dinner at Vivienne's estate. We'd just finished eating, and everyone was lounging in the grand living room. I was sipping a bourbon, trying to relax, when Vivienne sat down beside me. "Cassian," she said, her tone warm, almost motherly. "I hate to bring this up, but the church's annual gala is coming up soon. We've always been the top donors, but this year..." She trailed off, her eyes searching mine. "Things are a bit tight. You understand. I was hoping you could help us maintain our usual contribution. Just this once, of course." I hesitated. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be more than I was comfortable with. Vivienne smiled gently, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Only $10,000, she said. "It's nothing for someone like you." I looked over at Serafina, who was chatting with Celeste by the fireplace. She caught my eye, smiled, and nodded. I knew that if I said no, I'd have to explain myself to her later. And so, against my better judgment, I agreed. Vivian's smile widened, and she squeezed my arm. "You're such a blessing, Cassian," she said. But as I handed over my check, I didn't feel like a blessing. I felt like a fool. After that, the requests started coming more frequently. Serafina's sister needed help with a car payment. Vivian had another charity event that needed funding. The Alden summer home needed repairs. Every time, they framed it as something small. Something that would mean so much to the family. "It's just a drop in the bucket," Celeste said once, waving off my concerns. "You make 6 figures, Cass. You're practically printing money." I started to wonder if they even saw me as a person anymore, or just a never-ending source of cash. The worst part was, I couldn't talk to Serafina about it. Every time I tried, she'd get this wounded look on her face, like I was betraying her trust. "I thought you loved my family," she said one night, tears glistening in her eyes. "I thought you wanted to be part of this." I hated seeing her cry. I hated feeling like I was letting her down. So I stopped bringing it up. I just kept paying. Then came the wedding. Celeste had found a fiancé, a charming guy named Dorian. He was polite, respectful, and seemed genuinely happy to be marrying into the Alden family. But when it came to the wedding expenses, all eyes turned to me. Vivian pulled me aside at dinner one evening, her voice hushed but urgent. "Cassian, we've booked the venue," she said. "It's at the Parkhurst estate, absolutely stunning. But the deposit..." She trailed off, waiting for me to ask. "How much is it?" I asked, dreading the answer. $115,000, she said, smiling as if that number was completely reasonable. I stared at her, not sure if I'd heard right. "You already booked it?" I asked. "Of course," she said. "It's Celeste's big day. We couldn't wait." I looked at Serafina, who was sitting with Celeste at the other end of the room. She looked so happy, so carefree. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell them to figure it out themselves. But I knew what would happen if I did. I'd be the bad guy. I'd be the one who didn't care about family. So I said yes. Again. That night, as I sat at my desk, staring at my bank statements, the weight of it all hit me. The numbers didn't lie. My savings were draining fast. I'd worked so hard to build a safety net, to invest wisely, to secure a future for myself. And now, I was watching it slip away. I rubbed my temples, trying to push down the rising panic. I told myself I'd draw the line after the wedding. No more favors, no more handouts. I'd stand firm. But even as I made that promise, I felt a sinking feeling in my gut. Deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. They had already shown me that they didn't respect boundaries. They didn't even see them. And I had let it get this far. It wasn't just about the money. It was about control. They'd figured out how to make me doubt myself, how to make me feel like I owed them something. They used guilt, charm, and nostalgia like weapons. And I fell for it every time. I hated that they could make me question my own worth, my own instincts. I hated that I couldn't talk to Serafina without feeling like I was the problem. Most of all, I hated that I'd lost sight of who I was. As I sat there that night, my laptop screen glowing in the dark, I made another promise to myself. I would find a way out of this. I didn't know how, not yet. But I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting them drain me. I had to take back control. I had to remember who I was before all of this. And I had to do it before it was too late. And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, they pulled one final stunt that took me completely by surprise. What would you do in my shoes? Would you walk away and never look back? Or would you fight back and make them regret it? Comment. 1-1 if you'd leave, or 2-2 if you'd fight. As I sat in the quiet of my home office, staring at the glowing financial spreadsheet on my laptop, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me like a physical force. Every transaction told a story: dinners, trips, gifts, donations. I had always been generous by nature, happy to help the people I loved. But now, that generosity was starting to feel less like a choice and more like an obligation. One I hadn't even agreed to. I glanced at the numbers again, hoping they'd look better the second time around. But of course, they didn't. The savings I'd worked so hard to build were shrinking at an alarming rate. And the investments I should have been growing were instead being liquidated piece by piece to cover expenses that weren't even mine. It was surreal. Here I was, a man who spent his career navigating financial risks, managing multi-million-dollar portfolios, and making sound, strategic decisions. And yet, in my personal life, I was bleeding cash at a rate that would make my clients recoil in horror. It wasn't just the big expenses, though those were bad enough. It was the constant drip, drip, drip of smaller costs that added up over time. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. It didn't seem like much at first, but now, looking back over the past year, I could see the pattern as clearly as if it were printed in bold letters on the screen. They'd come to me with smiles and charm, presenting each request as if it were a one-time favor, a little thing that meant the world to them. "Cassian, would you mind covering this month's rent for Celeste? She's in a rough spot," Serafina had asked once, her voice so soft, so pleading, that I hadn't even thought twice before agreeing. Then there was the trip to the Cape, the one where I paid for the entire house rental, the groceries, the catered dinners. "It's our family's tradition," Vivienne had said, her tone so warm, so convincing. "We'd hate to break it just because things are tight this year." I had nodded, pulling out my credit card, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And then there were the endless little gifts, designer handbags that Serafina swore were investment pieces, spa weekends for Celeste, lavish birthday parties for Vivienne. I told myself it was all part of being in a family, part of taking care of the people you love. But as I stared at the numbers now, I could see how wrong I'd been. It was the wedding that finally brought it into focus. I still remember the moment I got that call from Vivienne, her voice smooth as silk, as if she were giving me the honor of funding the most extravagant event in their family's history. "Cassian, dear," she had said, "the venue deposit is coming up soon. It's at the Parkhurst estate, you know, the one with the glass conservatory and the lake view, absolutely breathtaking. We just know it's going to be perfect." There was a pause, and then, so casually it almost sounded like an afterthought, she said, "The deposit is $115,000. It's a steal, really, for a venue of this caliber." I remember feeling a knot in my stomach, but before I could even process what she was saying, Serafina was there, smiling at me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime event, love," she said softly. "Please." And just like that, my resolve crumbled. I wired the money the next day. But even that wasn't enough. After the venue came the flowers, another $25,000. Then the catering, $30,000. And then the dress. "Oh, Cassian," Celeste had gushed, "I found the most incredible gown. Custom designed, one of a kind. It's just breathtaking. The designer said it's in the 5-figure range, but honestly, it's worth every penny." I had stared at her, stunned by the casual way she said it, as if 5 figures were nothing at all. And then Vivienne had chimed in, her voice dripping with honey. "Cassian, you've always been so generous. Celeste would be over the moon if you could help her with this." I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell them that I'd done enough, that they could cover the rest themselves. But I knew what would happen if I refused. The cold stares, the quiet judgment, the subtle reminders from Serafina that I was supposed to be part of the family, and family took care of each other. I gave in again, telling myself it would be the last time. But it never was. That was the thing. Every time I thought I was done, there was something else. Another expense, another favor, another guilt-laden plea that I couldn't say no to. And with each transaction, I felt myself slipping further and further away from who I used to be. I had always been proud of my independence, my ability to stand on my own and make decisions that were best for me. But now, I felt like I was losing control, like I was being pulled along by a current I couldn't escape. And the worst part was, they didn't even see it. To them, I wasn't Cassian, the man. I was Cassian, the provider. Cassian, the problem solver. Cassian, the bottomless wallet. I thought back to that night at the estate, when I had sat in the grand dining room, listening to Vivienne talk about the church gala. "It's tradition," she had said, her voice as sweet as ever. "We've always been the top donors. It's what your father-in-law would have wanted." I had nodded, not because I believed her, but because it was easier than arguing. I'd written the check, watched her slip it into her purse with a smile, and felt the familiar pang of regret. I told myself that after the gala, I'd put my foot down. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Every time I tried to set boundaries, they'd find a way around them. Every time I hesitated, they'd double down on the charm, the guilt, the carefully crafted words that made me feel like saying no would mean losing them. It wasn't until I sat down that night and looked at my bank statements that the reality hit me. The numbers didn't lie. They painted a clear picture of how much I had given, how much they had taken, and how little they seemed to care. The truth was, I had been blind to it for far too long. I had let them manipulate me, guilt me, and push me into a role I never wanted. And now, as I stared at those cold, hard numbers, I realized that something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting them control my life, my finances, my sense of self. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but one thing was certain: I was done being their ATM. I tried to set boundaries. After reviewing my finances and seeing how quickly the numbers were dropping, I knew I couldn't keep saying yes. So, one evening, as Serafina and I were sitting on the couch, I finally told her. "I can't keep paying for everything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's not sustainable." At first, she just blinked at me, like she couldn't quite understand what I was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, tilting her head in that way she always did when she wanted to seem innocent. I sighed. "I mean the wedding, the trips, the constant handouts. It's too much. I'm not made of money, Serafina. The first worked hard for my savings, and now I'm watching them disappear." She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. "Cassian, it's not like you're going broke. You're doing well. You make good money. This is just what family does." Her response hit me harder than I expected. I'd hoped she would understand, that she would see how unfair it all was. But instead, she dismissed my concerns, as if I were being selfish for even bringing them up. I felt my chest tighten as I tried again. "That's the problem," I said. "It's not about whether I can afford it. It's about the fact that it's all on me. No one else is contributing, and I can't be the only one keeping everything afloat." She frowned, crossing her arms. "You make it sound like they're taking advantage of you," she said quietly. "But this is my family, Cass. They've done so much for me, for us. How can you even say no to them?" Her voice cracked slightly, and I could see the tears starting to form in her eyes. I felt that familiar pang of guilt, but I forced myself to push past it. "Serafina, I love your family," I said, my voice softening. "But this isn't love, this is obligation. And I can't keep living like this." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes wide and shiny, her lips pressed together. Finally, she stood up, brushing past me without a word, and went into the bedroom. I heard the door click shut. I sat there for a while, staring at the blank TV screen, my stomach churning. I knew I'd said the right thing. I had to draw the line somewhere. But that didn't make it any easier. I kept thinking about her words, about the way she made it sound like I was turning my back on family. Was I being selfish? Was I the bad guy for not wanting to pay for every little thing? I didn't have an answer, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. The next morning, Serafina acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, handed me a cup of coffee, and asked about my day. For a moment, I wondered if she'd actually taken what I said to heart. Maybe she'd realized that I couldn't keep supporting everyone on my own. But when she brought up Celeste's upcoming bridal shower, I knew she hadn't. "Mom thinks it would be nice to host it at the Four Seasons," she said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "She says it would be a beautiful way to celebrate. What do you think?" I stared at her, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. "Serafina, you know that's going to cost a fortune," I said. She smiled faintly. "It's Celeste's special day. She deserves something nice." I set the cup down, my hand shaking slightly. "I just told you last night that I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice tight. "Why are you asking me for more money?" She blinked at me, looking genuinely surprised. "I didn't think it would be a problem," she said, her voice calm. "You've always been so generous before." I felt my jaw clench as I stared at her. It wasn't that she didn't understand, she did. She just didn't care. She had no intention of changing, no intention of setting limits or asking her family to step up. And why would she? I'd always been the one to say yes, to make things happen, to clean up the mess. I realized then that my words hadn't sunk in, because she didn't want them to. It was easier for her to keep pretending that this was normal. That this was how families worked. And as long as I kept paying, she didn't have to face the reality of what she was asking me to do. I refused to pay for the bridal shower. For the first time, I stood my ground. If your mom wants to host it at the Four Seasons, she can pay for it herself, I said firmly. Serafina's smile faltered, and I could see the anger starting to creep into her expression. Cass, this is for my sister, she said, her voice sharper now. She's counting on us. I shook my head. No, I said. She's counting on me, and I'm done being the only one holding everything together. Serafina didn't argue further, but her silence spoke volumes. She turned away from me and walked out of the room, her shoulders tense. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss, like a piece of our relationship had just cracked, maybe for good. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our apartment grew tense. Serafina barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was short and clipped. I tried to remind myself that I was standing up for myself, that I couldn't keep sacrificing my financial stability to keep the peace. But it was hard. The guilt was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I knew I wasn't responsible for their choices, for their spending. But that didn't make it any easier to see the disappointment on Serafina's face. I kept waiting for her to come around, to acknowledge that I had a point. But instead, she seemed to double down. I'd overhear her on the phone with her mother, her voice hushed but urgent. Cass is being difficult, she'd say. I don't know what's gotten into him. He used to be so supportive. Her words stung, but I didn't confront her. I didn't see the point. She knew exactly what she was doing, making me feel like I was the problem. Like I was the one who had changed. And maybe I had. Maybe I was finally waking up to the fact that I'd been taken for granted for far too long. One evening, I found myself alone in the apartment, Serafina off at one of her family's planning sessions for the wedding. I sat at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the financial records spread out before me. The numbers didn't lie. I had spent more than I ever thought possible on a wedding that wasn't mine, on events I didn't even attend, on luxuries I never asked for. I felt the anger rising, hot and sharp. How had I let it get this far? How had I allowed myself to be used so thoroughly, so completely? I drained the glass and stood up, pacing the room. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep letting guilt and obligation dictate my every decision. I had tried to set boundaries, but Serafina didn't want them. Her family didn't want them. They wanted the old Cassian, the one who always said yes, who always made it work. But that Cassian was gone. I had to believe that. I had to hold on to that, because if I didn't, I'd lose myself completely. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to be their scapegoat anymore. The morning started the same as any other. I poured a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and stared out at the city from the kitchen window. The sun was barely up, and the streets below were still quiet, rare for Manhattan. But as I took a sip, that familiar knot formed in my stomach again. My phone buzzed on the counter, and without even looking, I knew it would be her. It always was. Cassian, dear, good morning. Vivienne's voice rang through the speaker, warm and practiced as always. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. No, I said, setting my coffee down. What's going on? Well, she began, her tone shifting slightly. It's about the wedding. We were talking last night, just some small details. Nothing major, and we realized we need to secure the musicians for the reception. It's nothing extravagant. Just a string quartet for the cocktail hour, and then a band for the main event. I think it's only another $12,000. Only. I gripped the counter, biting back my first response. I took a deep breath. Vivienne, I told you before, I'm not covering anything else. There was a pause. Not long. Just a second or two, but I knew she wasn't expecting that answer. Oh, I see, she said. Finally, her voice losing a touch of its warmth. I just thought, since you've been so supportive, you wouldn't mind helping us finish the arrangements. But I understand. I'll let Serafina know. I clenched my jaw. I could hear the faint edge of disappointment in her voice, the subtle way she framed it so I'd be the bad guy. But I held firm. Thanks, Vivienne, I said, and ended the call before she could say more. I took another sip of coffee, staring out at the skyline. But it didn't taste right anymore. My stomach churned as I thought about how that conversation would play out when Serafina heard about it. She wouldn't come at me directly. She never did. No. She'd wait until we were sitting on the couch tonight, her head resting on my shoulder, and she'd bring it up casually. "Mom mentioned you didn't want to help with the music," she'd say. Her voice soft, almost hurt. "I guess I just didn't realize how stressed you've been. I wish you'd talk to me." And just like that, I'd be the one apologizing. Except not this time. This time, I was done. I wasn't going to give in. I wasn't going to let them keep pushing me until I had nothing left. I couldn't. The rest of the day felt heavier than it should have. I went through the motions at work, reviewing contracts and sitting in on conference calls, but my mind kept drifting back to that conversation. I kept picturing Vivienne's disappointed smile, the way her voice turned just cool enough to make me second-guess myself. I imagined Serafina's expression when she heard about it, how she'd look at me like I'd let her down. I hated that it still got to me, that I still cared what they thought. I hated that I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing. Was I being too rigid? Too selfish? Or was I finally standing up for myself? That evening, as I walked back to our apartment, I could see the lights on inside. Serafina was home. My chest tightened as I stepped into the elevator, the familiar ding marking each floor. By the time I reached our door, my palms were clammy. I didn't want to have the conversation. I knew it was coming, but there was no avoiding it. When I walked in, she was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She turned and smiled. "Hey, you're home early. How was your day?" I forced a smile, setting my briefcase down by the door. "Same as always. How about you?" "Not bad," she said, leaning against the counter. "I talked to Mom for a bit. She said she called you about the music." There it was. The opening salvo. I nodded, hanging my coat on the rack. "Yeah, she did." Serafina took a sip of her wine, watching me carefully. "She mentioned you weren't comfortable helping out." "I told her I'm not paying for it," I said evenly. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and twisted off the cap. "I've already done enough." Serafina frowned, setting her glass down. "I thought we were in this together," she said softly. "I thought you understood how much this means to my family." I felt my shoulders tense. "I do," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "But that doesn't mean I have to keep footing the bill for everything. I've been more than generous, Serafina. It's time for them to step up." She tilted her head, her gaze searching mine. "They're my family, Cass," she said quietly. "They've always been there for me. I just want them to have the wedding they've dreamed of." I took a deep breath, setting the water bottle on the counter. "And I want them to take some responsibility. I can't keep doing this. It's not fair." Serafina looked down at the counter, her fingers tracing the stem of her wine glass. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize you felt this way. I've been trying to tell you," I said, softening my tone. "But every time I bring it up, it feels like you don't hear me. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just trying to be honest." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing together. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll talk to them." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but for now, it was enough. I left the kitchen, taking my water with me, and sat down on the couch. The apartment was quiet again, but I didn't feel any sense of relief. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath me. As the night wore on, Serafina retreated to the bedroom, and I stayed in the living room, flipping through channels, but not really watching anything. My mind kept going back to the way she looked at me when she said, "I thought we were in this together." It wasn't just disappointment I saw. It was something else, something darker. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my own guilt, my own doubt, playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Something I couldn't control. I finally turned off the TV and went to bed. Serafina was already asleep, her back to me. I lay there in the dark, listening to her steady breathing, and tried to push the thoughts out of my mind. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about how we got here, how everything had gone from love and trust to tension and doubt. I couldn't stop wondering if it was too late to fix it, or if it was even worth fixing at all. I couldn't stop thinking that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally reached the point of no return. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Serafina acted like nothing had happened, like I hadn't drawn a line in the sand. But that line was there, bold and unmistakable, at least in my own mind. I tried to convince myself that I was in control now, that standing my ground would shift the dynamic. The problem was, no one else seemed to notice the line, or worse, they pretended it wasn't there at all. Vivienne's calls didn't stop. Celeste still texted me about her latest once-in-a-lifetime find. And Serafina, well, she had a way of turning every conversation into an invitation for me to bend again, even if she never said the words outright. One evening, we were sitting on the couch. The TV was on, though neither of us was paying much attention. She was scrolling through her phone, and I was pretending to care about the news anchor's commentary. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Do you think we should fly out to Aspen for New Year's?" I turned my head slowly. "What?" She shrugged, her eyes still on her screen. "Celeste mentioned it earlier. We used to go every year when we were kids. It could be nice to start that tradition again." I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or yell. "Serafina, I just told you we need to cut back." Her thumb paused mid-scroll, and she looked up at me, her expression innocent. "This would be more about family than money," she said. "It's not like we'd stay at the Street Regis. We could rent a cabin or something." "You mean I could rent a cabin?" I said flatly. She blinked, caught off guard. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "What's not fair is pretending this is some little family reunion. What you're really saying is that you want me to fund another vacation for everyone, and I'm supposed to just smile and say yes." Her face tightened, her lips forming a thin line. "It's not like that." "It feels exactly like that," I shot back. "It's always about what I can do for your family, not what we can do together. And I'm tired of it." She set her phone down, folding her arms. "Cass, I don't understand why you're making this into such a big deal. You've always been generous. What's changed?" "Everything," I said. "The constant asking, the expectation that I'll always say yes. It's not about generosity anymore, Serafina. It's about being taken for granted." Her jaw tightened. "You make it sound like I'm using you." I opened my mouth, then closed it. How was I supposed to say it without sounding cruel? How was I supposed to explain that her silence, her complicity in all of it, was just as bad as the requests themselves? I felt a lump form in my throat, and I looked away, my gaze settling on the muted TV. "I don't think you see what's happening," I said finally, my voice low. "Or maybe you don't want to." She stared at me, her eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. The room felt heavy, the silence stretching between us until it became almost unbearable. I wanted her to argue, to push back, to tell me I was wrong. Instead, she stood up, grabbed her phone, and walked into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the TV filling the empty space. My head felt like it was spinning. Part of me wanted to chase after her, to keep talking, to try one more time to make her understand. But another part of me, a growing part, knew it wouldn't matter. She'd listen, nod, maybe even apologize. But nothing would change. It never did. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt a sense of dread creep over me. The Aspen trip was just one more example of how little she heard me. How little she understood what I was trying to say. I didn't want to be the bad guy, the one who always said no. But if I didn't say no, I'd be swallowed whole. By the time morning came, I knew something had to give. I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep letting her family's endless requests pull me further and further away from myself. I needed to make a decision, a real one. Not just a line in the sand, but a line I'd stick to no matter what. I got up early, showered, and dressed, my movements slow and deliberate. As I stood in the bathroom, looking at my reflection, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. The confidence, the calm, the self-assuredness I used to have, it was all buried under layers of frustration and doubt. I took a deep breath, splashed water on my face, and made up my mind. I wasn't going to bend anymore, no matter what. I don't know what I expected when I finally said no. Maybe an argument. Maybe some long, drawn-out conversation, where she'd try to convince me one last time. But it wasn't like that. Serafina didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't even try to reason with me. She just went quiet, eerily quiet. And then she left the room. I stood there in the kitchen, my coffee going cold in my hand, staring at the door she'd just walked through. For a moment, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe I'd finally gotten through to her. But deep down, I knew better. The first sign that something was off came a few days later. I'd been swamped at work, trying to finish a proposal that had been dragging on for weeks. I barely looked up from my desk the entire day. When I finally got home, I noticed the mail sitting on the counter. There was a thick envelope from the venue where Celeste's wedding was supposed to take place. At first, I thought it was just another confirmation notice, something Vivienne had set up. But when I opened it, I saw the final invoice, marked paid in full. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't paid it, which meant someone else had. And I had a pretty good idea who. I found Serafina sitting in the living room, scrolling on her phone as if nothing had happened. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the envelope. She glanced at it briefly, then went back to her phone. "Oh," she said casually. "I took care of it." "You took care of it?" I echoed, my voice rising. "With what money?" She looked up at me, tilting her head slightly. "Cass, don't start. Don't start." I felt the heat rising in my chest. "You went behind my back and paid for it anyway?" Her expression hardened. It had to be done. I wasn't going to let my sister's wedding fall apart. I stared at her, my mind racing. How? How did you pay for it? Did you use my card?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. "Unbelievable," I said, running a hand through my hair. "You knew I was against this, and you did it anyway. What part of I can't keep paying didn't you understand? It's not just about the money," she snapped. "It's about my family. You wouldn't understand because you've never had that kind of connection." I froze, her words hitting me like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, quietly, I said, "That's low, even for you." She rolled her eyes, standing up and brushing past me. "I don't have time for this. The wedding's happening, and that's that." I watched her walk away, anger and disbelief churning inside me. This wasn't just a matter of money anymore. It was a matter of trust that she'd completely shattered. I sat down on the couch, the envelope still in my hand, staring at the itemized list of charges. The deposit, the catering, the floral arrangements all paid in full. By me, without my consent. I felt like I was suffocating. Like the walls of our apartment were closing in on me. This wasn't a marriage anymore. This was a transaction. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep paying the price. I tried to push it out of my mind. But the betrayal lingered. That night, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling, running through every conversation, every moment that had led up to this. How had we gotten to the point where she could take money from me, our money, without so much as a discussion? It wasn't the first time I'd felt blindsided. But this was different. This was calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway. The trust was gone, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be rebuilt. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. I needed to clear my head, to step away from the tension that had settled over our apartment like a heavy fog. I buried myself in spreadsheets, meetings, and calls, trying to focus on anything other than the growing resentment in my chest. But every time my phone buzzed, I felt my stomach clench. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see another text from Serafina or, worse, from Vivienne. By lunchtime, I was too restless to stay at my desk. I grabbed my jacket and walked out into the cold, heading toward the little coffee shop around the corner. As I sipped my coffee, watching people hurry by on the sidewalk, I started to question everything. Had I been too passive, too trusting? Was it my fault that this had spiraled so far out of control? I thought back to the early days of our relationship, when everything felt so simple. I'd been so sure she loved me, not for what I could provide. But now I wasn't so sure. Now I couldn't ignore the pattern, the endless requests, the guilt trips, the way her family always seemed to expect me to foot the bill. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about partnership, about the foundation of our marriage. And right now, that foundation was crumbling. When I finally returned to the office, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the envelope I'd found on the counter, to the look in Serafina's eyes when she told me it was taken care of. There hadn't been any remorse, no acknowledgement that she'd crossed a line. It was as if she truly believed she had every right to do it. That was what stung the most, not just the act itself, but the lack of any attempt to make it right. She didn't see what she'd done as a betrayal. She saw it as business as usual. By the time I left work that evening, I felt more exhausted than I had in months. I walked home slowly, dreading the inevitable confrontation waiting for me. But when I stepped through the door, the apartment was empty. Serafina had left a note on the kitchen table. Out with Mom and Celeste, don't wait up. I stared at the note for a long time, the words blurring together as my anger boiled over. She didn't even think this was worth discussing. She didn't see the problem. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't care. I sat down at the table, the note still in my hand. I thought about texting her, about calling her out right then and there. But what would it accomplish? We'd had this fight before, in different forms, and it always ended the same way. She'd apologize, say all the right things, and then do exactly what she wanted anyway. I was tired of fighting a battle I couldn't win. As the hours passed and the apartment stayed silent, I started to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just about one payment, one argument. This was about a pattern, a cycle that had been building for years. And it wasn't going to stop, unless I made it stop. I had to take back control not just of my finances, but of my life. I had to find a way to break free from this toxic dynamic. And if that meant making some hard decisions, so be it. When I finally saw her that night, it was like watching a stranger move through the apartment. She came home late, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, a faint scent of expensive wine trailing behind her. She barely looked at me as she hung her coat in the closet and headed toward the bedroom. For a moment, I just sat there on the couch, staring after her, wondering how the hell we'd gotten to this point. The tension was suffocating, thick as smoke, but I knew if I didn't speak up now, I never would. Serafina, the first said, my voice cutting through the silence. She stopped halfway down the hall, her hand resting on the doorframe. When she turned, her expression was unreadable neutral, almost detached. We need to talk, I said. She crossed her arms, leaning against the frame. Talk about what? I stood up, running a hand through my hair. About what you did. About the money. About everything. She sighed, tilting her head. Cass, it's late. Can we do this tomorrow? No, I said firmly. We're doing this now. She frowned, but she didn't argue. Instead, she walked back to the living room, sat down on the opposite end of the couch, and waited. I sat too, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I didn't know where to start. How to put everything I was feeling into words that she might actually hear. Finally I said, I trusted you. She blinked, caught off guard. Cassian, I didn't mean. You didn't mean what? I cut her off. You didn't mean to take my money without telling me. You didn't mean to undermine every boundary I tried to set. Her expression hardened. I wasn't trying to undermine you. I was trying to fix things. Fix things? I laughed bitterly. You think this is fixing things? Sneaking behind my back, making decisions that affect both of us without even asking me? What was I supposed to do, Cass? She snapped, her voice rising. Let my sister's wedding fall apart? Let my family down? Yes. I shot back. If it meant respecting me, respecting our marriage, then yes. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You don't mean that, she said quietly. I do, I said, my voice steady now. I mean every word. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep being the only one who compromises, the only one who sacrifices. I can't keep pouring everything I have into a family that doesn't appreciate it, and a wife who doesn't care how it affects me. Her eyes narrowed. You think I don't care? I'm doing this for us, Cassian, for our future. No, I said, shaking my head. You're doing it for them, for your mother, for your sister. Not for us, and definitely not for me. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could see her struggling, searching for something to say that would shift the balance back in her favor. I thought you loved me, she said finally, her voice trembling. I do, I said. But love isn't enough when there's no respect. Love isn't enough when I feel like I'm the only one carrying the weight of this relationship. She looked away, her hands clenching and unclenching in her lap. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she whispered. I thought if I just handled it, you wouldn't have to worry. I thought it would be easier that way. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. It's not easier, I said. It's never been easier. I need you to understand that. I need you to see how much this has cost me, not just in money, but in trust, in peace of mind, in us. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the floor, her shoulders tense, her jaw tight. What do you want me to do? She asked. Finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to stop, I said. Stop the spending. Stop the excuses. Stop putting everyone else's needs ahead of ours. I want you to start treating this marriage like a partnership, not a one-man show where I'm the only one funding the production. Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. That's not fair, isn't it? I countered. Think about everything I've done. The wedding, the trips, the handouts. Have you ever once thought about what that does to me? About how it feels to be used? I didn't mean to use you, she exclaimed, her voice breaking. You just what? I said, my voice softer now. You just thought it was okay, because I never said no before? You just assumed I'd keep saying yes because I loved you? That's not love, Serafina. That's taking advantage. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away again. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. I don't know how to make it right. You start by listening, I said. Really listening. You start by taking responsibility for your actions, and being honest about what you've done. And then, maybe, we figure out how to move forward together. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as if the fight had gone out of her. Okay, she said. I'll try. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like she was actually hearing me. And that gave me hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Hope that this marriage wasn't beyond saving. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, I was willing to see if we could rebuild the trust that had been broken. Because despite everything, I still loved her, and maybe that was enough. They thought I'd stay silent. They thought I'd let them get away with it, but they underestimated me. I fought back, I won, and I'll never let anyone use me again. What would you have done differently? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed my story, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. No one should feel trapped in a relationship where their worth is measured only by what they can give. I learned the hard way that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. When you keep saying yes to avoid conflict, you only invite more demands. Love should be a partnership, not a transaction. If we each stand firm, speak honestly, and value ourselves, we can build stronger, healthier connections. That's the American way: self-respect, mutual respect, and the courage to say no when it matters. Don't let anyone take advantage of your kindness. Know your limits, and stick to them.